Hi, everyone. Welcome back again. We're looking at the carbon tax scheme and the emissions trading scheme, which we refer to as ETS. And we're going to look at the mechanics of how it works, why it has been implemented, and actual practice worldwide. So stay tuned and let's get into this session. Okay, if we look worldwide, we can see that the red marks instances or states that have implemented or have scheduled for implementation emissions trading schemes. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that, well, you won't notice because I'm in front of it, but you'll see that, look at this, Australia does not have a scheme in place, although the current Labor government have announced that there's going to be a scheme in place. But that was because they announced it back in 2014, and a decade later, we're going to put something back in, although of a much reduced scope and effect. Anyway, what else do you notice? Have a look at right over there, United States. You can see that, wow, it's just California, it's just Washington, it's just Oregon that have introduced an emissions trading scheme. What about the other 50 odd states? And look at Canada. Some of their states have introduced it and some have not. But if we look at China, basically all of China have implemented an emissions trading scheme, even Kazakhstan, and then most of the EU countries have introduced an ETS, although they're Poland, France, Spain, UK, and Scandinavia have gone with the implementation of the ETS and carbon tax. Whereas if you look at the other countries in the EU, they're either scheduled for implementation. What you learn here is that different states, this is a very political issue. And when you see that one country and there's only certain states implementing such schemes, that tells you it is very political. It tells you in Australia it's very political because in 2014 it was repealed and now they're bringing it back in 2023. In the States, California have got it, but other states have not. That's the politics. So one thing you want to take away as we get into the mechanics and why and all of that, yes, you realize from this talk that, wow, we should implement this, and in no time fast. But the reality is that it is a very political charged mechanism to introduce. So you've got to be very, very careful and very savvy about how you introduce it. To what extent do you introduce it? Do you just focus on certain industries or do you focus on many industries? And different countries have taken different approaches to their implementation. All right. So what is it? The only way to prevent, why are we doing this? Okay. The only way to prevent the increase in the global average temperatures is by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. What are we talking about here? We're actually talking about the emissions of CO2. When we burn fossil fuels, we release CO2, carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. And then that causes the rise in the average temperature of the planet, and that's not good for the long term. All right, okay. So what's the best way to deal with this? Well, to change people's behavior, to introduce technology and alternatives, to upgrade infrastructure so it's less taxing on the environment. But, people don't always behave the way they should. So the best mechanism that we know of to actually change people's behavior, change companies' behavior, all right, is to have some kind of price mechanism. And so you're actually putting a price or a charge on your behavior of emitting CO2s into the atmosphere. And there are two basic ways of doing that, and that is through carbon pricing. And the second way is through emissions trading schemes. Wow. All right. So we know we have to deal with this greenhouse gas problem, right? We know that we all behave badly when we don't see the direct effects of our behavior, either individually or as companies, right? They're externalities that impact on society or the community, and we don't always see that effect when we purchase goods, when we're driving a car, when the company is digging coal out of the ground, when the electricity plant is burning coal to generate electricity. We don't always see that effect on the community, on society, on the world, all right? And so that's why we have to have this pricing mechanism to wake us up, to make sure that we are actually taking actions that are aligned with reducing the greenhouse gases that are being emitted into the environment every year. Right. So what I'm going to take you through is this notion of what are carbon taxes. Then we're going to look at emissions trading schemes, and then we're going to look at actual practice around the world, although I've already given you a brief introduction of that. All right, so a carbon tax is a tax levied on the carbon content of fuels. It is a form of carbon pricing. Carbon is present in every hydrocarbon fuel like coal, petroleum, natural gas, and is released as carbon dioxide when they are burned. In contrast, non-combustion energy sources, wind, sunlight, hydropower, and nuclear do not convert hydrocarbons into CO2. And CO2 is a heat-trapping greenhouse gas, which represents a negative externality on the climate system. And as we can see, if we want to put a tax, and we see just above me the actual level of the prices, what is the price of carbon? We're going to look at shortly about the challenges of at what level should we tax carbon emissions, but already there is a price of carbon out there in the world, and the EU, the carbon price topped €100 for the first time last year. But if we look at UK, that is up around that area. And then if you look at the far right-hand side, you have the Australian spot rate, which is only $20, $30 per tonne of CO2 emission. All right. More about that as we come. So the nature of a carbon tax, why do we want to put a tax in that we know is naturally going to be regressive? Why? Because the tax does not increase as your income goes up. That's a progressive tax. The tax is the same no matter whether you earn $1 or earn $1 million. And so therefore, if you emit 1 tonne of CO2, then you have to pay the same tax whether you earn $1 or $1 million. So it's a regressive tax. And regressive taxes are known as Pigovian taxes, named after the econometrician economist Pigovian back in the 1915, 1920, the last century. Okay, long time ago. All right. Anyway, it's a tax on the externality. It's a tax on the company's effect on the environment, on society, on the world. And the idea of imposing a tax is, number one, to get the company to impute that tax into the price of the goods that they are selling or the services that they are selling. And as a result, if we look at the graph above me, when the tax is emitted or imputed onto the price, the actually demand for that service, the demand for the price goes down this way because the price has gone up. And then you see that that has the effect of reducing CO2 emissions or carbon emissions on society. Why? Because the demand for goods or services has gone down. And you know what it was like with COVID. The demand for air travel went down and the emissions into the environment were much, much less for the first time in about 30 or 40, 50 years. An amazing consequence of a deadly virus back in 2020, 2021, and a bit of 2022. All right. Okay. Again, you put the tax on, it forces the producer or the service provider to increase the price and to impute the externality of that carbon tax into the price, into the service. So therefore consumers end up paying, and obviously demand may go down and the producer ends up actually earning less profits, and some of those profits go as form of taxes that go to the government for whatever the government allocates that revenue to. But it is a regressive tax, and it's not helpful for poor countries with less ability to pay. So that's the economists, that's the economics of a carbon tax. All right. And, you know, we can color it up even more and see that, yes, in the end, consumers have to pay a burden. Why? They have to pay more for the product or the service. And the producer loses some profits because they get to sell less of their product or service at the same time. All right. So, you know, that's a kind of like a polluter pays principle. But remember, it is a regressive tax. All right. So what are the benefits? So, you know, that's not very nice as a consumer. You have to pay more and demand goes down for producers, so they earn less profits. But what are the benefits? Well, it encourages alternatives. It encourages investment into wind energy, into water energy, into solar energy. It leads to a socially efficient outcome because it makes people pay the social costs and overcomes the excess consumption. Finally, it raises revenue for governments. And, you know, the purpose of the tax, first and foremost, should not be to raise revenue unless that revenue raised is directly channeled into incentivizing investment into alternatives, like providing subsidies for the purchase of solar panels to go on your house, providing investment subsidies for investments into wind energy, for example, all right? But you know, and I know that governments don't always do that. They always see a disconnection between revenue raised and where they spend their revenue. You know, that's the nature of politics and governments. All right, so it raises revenue, but we shouldn't see that as a big benefit of the carbon tax unless that revenue is incentivizing investment into alternative energies. So encouraging alternatives, we're leading to a more socially efficient outcome, and we're raising revenue at the same time. Okay, what about the problems of the carbon tax? Warpath, boom, 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 boom. No, warpath meaning, and this is what I've made out of these 7 words. That is, what level should we set the tax at? I don't know. You don't know. Governments don't know either. It's an experiment. And sometimes you really need to put the tax in place at a notional lower than what the level should be, and then move it up over time as we see the behavior of companies in the way in which they reduce production, reduce their services provisions. What other problems are there? Well, there are, if demand is too price inelastic, and what do we mean by that? We go back here. This is an example of an elastic demand where we see that this curve really doesn't move that, it doesn't really move much to the left as a result of the price increase. That's what we mean by inelastic. If it was elastic, it would be more like flatter. So therefore, when the price goes up a little bit, demand goes down a lot. So you don't need to have as big a tax when the demand is elastic. You have to have a larger tax if the demand is inelastic. Wow. All right. So often, if the demand is price inelastic, the tax may have to be too high to reduce demand significantly to encourage alternatives. Number 3, regressive. I've already mentioned it. It's Piggovian. So it doesn't care whether you are a poor country and don't have the resources to pay the tax versus a rich company like the United States and the EU that have the resources to pay these taxes and the consumption power to pay the taxes when the tax flows through to products and services. Number 4, it's politically sensitive. You know what happened in 2012? The government introduced that tax carbon emissions trading scheme, but in 2014, the new government came in and said, sorry, we're going to repeal the legislation and the carbon emissions trading scheme will be no longer. And it's basically taken a decade for it to be reinstituted, although at a much smaller and narrower margin. All right, more about that in coming slides. Administration costs. There's always administration costs of administrating tax. And related to that is tax evasion. You're relying on companies to actually do the right measurement and pay the right amount of tax. But companies don't always behave in alignment with taxing governments around the world. And then you've got havens. That is, you might have Malaysia say, oh, we're not having a carbon emissions trading. Please come and invest with us. We're not going to place a carbon tax on your emissions. And so that may attract production or supply chains from China, which has a carbon tax, from Australia, which now has a tax scheme. So you can see that countries can think of using the absence of a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme to actually attract investment in their country, like foreign direct investment. Wow. All right. So now I've talked about carbon taxes for a moment. Now we want to talk about emissions trading schemes. And so basically what we're allowing companies to emit carbon into the atmosphere. Okay, that's fine. But what we're trying to do is put a limit on the amount that you can emit. But that a limit is not limited for every company. It is a limit for the industry or the country. And then the players within that industry, all right, are divided up and given an individual limit based on that overall limit for that industry. And then those individual limits are called permits. And so you might have, Australia might have a limit of, say, 10 million tonnes, should be 100 million tonnes on the mining industry in Australia. And maybe there are 10 miners. So therefore, they're issued with a permit, considered equal, of 10 million tonnes each. And if they emit more than 10 million tonnes, then the emitter can go and purchase from those that emitted less than 10 million tonnes in order to keep the overall limit under 100 million tonnes. And that's what we mean by this cap and trade system. So in effect, the buyer is paying a charge for polluting more than that individual permit that was given to that buyer, while the seller gains a reward for having reduced emissions. Thus, in theory, those who can reduce emissions most cheaply will do so, achieving the pollution reduction at the lowest cost to society. And so look at the example above, and you say plant A over here can actually reduce its emissions more cheaply than plant B, right? Plant A only costs $100 to emit 100 tonnes less. Plant B costs them 200. So it's better for, above me here, it's better if we look here for plant A to actually use less and to receive payment from plant B, because plant B has actually emitted more than the cap. And so plant B will actually make payments to plant A. And so in some ways, plant A is doing the emitting for plant B. And so it's more efficient for plant A to actually reduce those emissions and then receive a payment from plant B. And plant B continues to be allowed to emit more than the cap. So you're probably thinking now, well, that's not right, because plant B is a costly emitter, but that's the way the cap and trade system works. So it enables those who are more efficient at reducing their emissions to be rewarded for reducing. Those that find it more costly to reduce, they will sooner go and pay those emitters that are under the cap, and then so they can continue to actually emit over the cap. But over time, if that cap does not change, then that's really not going to help the world much. That's not really going to help the, say, zero emissions by 2050 goal that much. So what happens with the emissions trading scheme is that over time, year by year by year, they reduce the cap down by 5%, by 5%, by 5%. And so companies know that they're going to have to reduce their emissions anyway, even if they are still buying for being over the cap. In the following year, they have to buy more if they emit the same emissions over the cap, because the cap has been reduced. So that's how the cap and trade system works. So it enables plant A and B to continue to operate, but over time, it gives both plant A and plant B the incentive to actually reduce their emissions over time. Wow. And so as I showed this graph before, you can see there is pricing for carbon out there in the markets, and EU over 100 euro per tonne. Australia, the spot rate is still 20 to 30 US dollars per tonne. But what we wanted to make a point here is that, you know, this whole notion of permits under the cap and trade is different depending on which country that you are in. So, for example, in the EU, the trading system happens primarily in the EU. And just if you're in the EU, you trade with other players in the EU. The Californian scheme in California, those players in California have to trade with other players in California. In New Zealand, it's the same. So these schemes are not universal. They're not global yet. Hence, you still have that challenge of, you know, pollution or carbon havens, where countries that don't have this may attract more carbon emission activity than countries or states that have this cap and trade schemes in place. Wow. All right. So, you know, we've already started talking about the benefits and the problems of carbon trading, but as I've said, it is the most cost-effective way to actually implement it in an industry, because it's not a tax immediately. It's kind of like it's a very incremental tax over time, because the cap is going to be reduced, and hopefully by 2050 it's going to be reduced to zero. But during that time, emitters are allowed to pay, if they're over that cap, to those who are under that cap. And so that enables companies to continue to operate in working out their own strategy for how fast they want to reduce their emissions over time. Another case is, as I've said, is the gradual reduction in the permit down to zero. So it actually it incentivizes companies. It's a positive encouragement for companies to say, look, in 20 years' time, you do need to have zero emissions, but right now you don't. But between now and then, you need to get strategies in place to make it happen. All right. Now, the costs or the arguments against are it's complex. And number two, there's difficulty in measuring. All right, because you need to try and measure. It's hard to put a price on the carbon trading. And at what cap? How do you set the cap? Do you want to set, if you set it too high, industry will throw their arms up and then vote you out of government. Set it too low, then it won't have as much incentive. And then you've got transaction costs involved in buying and selling permits. You need to set up a trading scheme. And finally, you've got the free rider problem, where not all countries around the world or jurisdictions are doing this. So therefore, there's that obvious benefit of having tax havens to attract foreign direct investment, which emerging economies, it is a great attraction advice to put in place. All right, so there's the for and against. And as I mentioned, yes, Australia is to reintroduce an emissions trading scheme, albeit much smaller. So under the scheme, businesses will only be forced to buy permits for emissions above a certain baseline, rather than for every tonne of carbon they emit, as under the EU's trading scheme. Businesses that undershoot their baselines will be given carbon credits that they can trade and sell to businesses that overshoot the baseline. Now, the big thing about the plan is that it will apply only to industrial emitters such as smelters, miners, manufacturers. It would exclude electricity generators and emissions from buildings, transport, and agriculture, and will be a softer policy than those in Europe, Britain, and North America. Oh, wow, this is so funny, because I want you to have a look at the next slide. All right, it excludes electricity generators, emissions from buildings, transport, and agriculture. Let's have a look. What are the main emitters in Australia? It is the electricity generators. It is transport. All right. It is agriculture. Wow. Making up more than 50% of the emissions. So, all right. Okay, Neil, let's not defeat something. At least they're trying, right? All right. So it's much a reduced scheme than what it was in 2012 and 2013. But I want you to be aware, okay, data-wise, how much tonnes of CO2 does Australia emit each year? We're talking about 500 million tonnes. All right, if you look at 2022, 487 million tonnes, and that's not from the government website. If you go back in 2018, it was 560 million tonnes. So there has been a reduction, and so that's a good thing, all right? And maybe as a student, I would be interested to find out, well, what is the share of the emissions by the big mining companies, which will be targeted with this emissions trading scheme? Like back in 2012, this was the free carbon units that were listed for these mining companies back then, because what happened was, in order to placate the protest by these mining companies back in 2012, 2013, the government gave out industry handouts. You know, they say, we'll allow you to keep emit without paying a carbon tax. Will be interesting to see where these companies are at in today, and that's something I'd like students to have a look at to find out what is the data for these companies that are going to be subject to the emissions trading scheme. What is the data for them as we speak today? All right, let's have a look at other countries. Japan introduced a carbon tax in 2012, India 2010. In Europe, they've already introduced it. Like, they started in 2005 and now covers 27 countries of the EU. And you can see that EU has been at it for, you know, close to 2 decades. All right, so we shouldn't be surprised that a lot of the regulations and the driving of policy associated with disclosure is coming out of the EU, and that's only going to get louder and louder and louder, and it's going to become as requirements in years to come, especially for listed companies. And now the SEC is on the bandwagon, requiring disclosure of scope 1 and scope 2 and coming scope 3 emissions by listed companies in the US. More about that next week. But for now, the EU has actually the leading proponent of emissions trading schemes, of carbon tax trading, carbon taxes, and all that sort of thing. All right, so Middle East companies, yeah, no tax on fossil fuel, no surprise. And there's no nationwide carbon tax levied in the USA. But as I said, they have an emissions trading scheme in Washington, in Portland, Oregon, in California, and that's been around for nearly close to a decade. And there's several other states that have emissions trading operating in the power sector since 2009. Canada does not have a federal carbon tax, but certain states do have an emissions trading scheme. The New Zealand government has it, and China has announced a national emissions trading scheme back in 2018. Wow, taken the lead of Australia too. Amazing that China is doing this, because it's basically the third largest emitter per capita by countries around the world, after USA and after Australia, per capita, that is. So, you know, these are good things that are happening for these top 3 countries. Finally, Australia is doing the emissions trading scheme. All right. So what's the summary? Greenhouse gas emission, it's a global problem. It is not a country problem. It is not a state problem. Pricing mechanisms is one way to price the externality consequences of our behavior. When I say our consumer behavior, our company behavior, our miners' behavior. We do this via carbon taxes or a carbon trading scheme. Number 3, the price of a metric ton of carbon is rising beyond 100 euros now on the EU market. And various countries have had challenges in implementing such pricing schemes. Part of these challenges, for the most part, have been political, as we said with what happened in Australia over a decade ago, and now the re-release of the emissions trading scheme is much more narrow, only really targeting probably 40% or less of the emissions of the Australians' total emissions in Australia. But overall, there's great awareness and investment into fossil fuel alternatives that is being pushed by the event of carbon tax emissions trading and the carbon tax. All right. So, the carbon tax and emissions trading, it's creating greater awareness. It's creating greater incentives to put into fossil fuel alternatives, into solar, wind energy, water energy, and so forth. So there you have it. Great stuff. And in the next week, we're going to be looking at the Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 module. And that's really going to drill down into what companies can do in terms of initiatives, goals, and strategy to actually reduce their Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. See you next week, and thank you for listening today. Bye for now.